Welcome to the cabin. Join me today as we're painting a Gor from the Beast of Chaos range for Age of Sigmar. I started by undercoating the model with Mechanicus Standard Grey, and after this I gave it a zenithal highlight using the airbrush and Liquitex Titanium White. You could just use either a grey or a white undercoat instead if you don't have access to an airbrush. Alternatively, you could also dry brush the model with a lighter color. So the first stage is to paint the skin. I started with a base coat of rat skin flesh that I applied in 2 coats to all the skin. After the base coat was dry, I applied a wash of Reichsland flesh shade all over the skin. To get some definition back, I added a layer of rat skin flesh all over the skin, but avoiding the deepest recesses where the shade had settled. Next, I added a layer of Cadian flesh tone, and this layer I tried to keep it a little bit more selective and a little bit more towards the top of all these areas of muscle around the skin to simulate light coming from above. Finally, the last stage is a highlight of Kislev flesh, again trying to be a little bit more selective and thinning down the paint so that it doesn't become too stark of a contrast to the rest of the skin. At this stage, I wanted to redefine some of the details in the shadows, so I took Reichsland flesh shade once again and applied it selectively, for example around the nipples and between the lips. Next up, we have all the fur on the model, and I start by giving these areas a base coat of Doombull Brown. And afterwards, I wash all of these areas with Agrax Earthshade. Once everything is dry, I use Tuskor fur to dry brush these areas, moving against the details, not following along the lines, but moving in the opposite direction to catch them and to get quite a natural highlight. Now it's time for all the leather, the straps, and the wood that's featuring on the miniature. I start by giving these areas a Zandri Dust base coat. And then I take a contrast paint called Snakebite Leather, and I dilute this one with some contrast medium to create a thinner wash. And I do 1 or maybe 2 passes sometimes, depending on the surface and the details of each area. Once this is dry, I use Zandri Dust again to edge highlight or dry brush, depending on the surface, to establish some of those highlights again. Next up, we have all the fabrics on the model. I start by giving them a base coat of Corn Red. I then wash the area with Karabur Crimson, and this creates quite a dark red, so we need to bring that up again. I start by layering over Corn Red once again, leaving the shade in the recesses. After that, I layer on top of it with Wazdaka Red, trying to be a bit more selective. Finally, I use Evil Sun Scarlet to do the final highlights, trying to keep the lines quite thin and sticking to the edges. To bring all these colors together, I'm using Blood Angels Red, which is another contrast paint. This time I'm diluting it with a lot of medium. I'm talking just a tiny bit of Blood Angels Red to create a glaze. We don't want a wash or a shade. This one is just to glaze all over the areas and bring them together in a uniform red color. As I was doing the red areas, I also did the eyes on the Gor. So I used Wazdaka Red as a base coat. And after that, I just added a tiny dot of Wild Rider Red in the middle of the eyes. Next up, we have the horns and the hooves on the model. I start by giving them a base coat of Steel Legion Drab. And I do a selective wash of Agrax Earthshade, just trying to stick to the deepest parts of the model. After that, I add a layer of Xandri Dust, pretty much all over the surface except for the very deepest recesses. After that, it's Ushap di Bone, and this layer I keep a little thinner to let some of the Xandri Dust show through. Finally, as an edge highlight, I do a very, very thin line of Wraithbone on the very top of these areas. And just like we did with the red fabrics, I am using Skeleton Horde diluted with a lot of contrast medium to create a glaze, just to bring all the colors together. The bones and the skulls on the models are painted with Wraithbone as a base coat. And then I add pure Skeleton Horde, no dilution or anything, I just add the pure contrast paint all over these areas. And when everything is dry, I'm using Screaming Skull as a highlight, as well as filling in the claws and the teeth if the model has an open mouth. The only thing left now are the metal parts, so I'm using Lead Belcher as a base coat on the weapons and the trinkets and chainmail and details such as that. Followed by a wash of Agrax Earthshade to make it look dirty and worn. Sometimes on larger surfaces I would use 2 layers to really dull it down. And finally, I use Runefang Steel to do an edge highlight and also a little bit of chipping to make the axe head pop a little bit more. The only thing left now is to use Abaddon Black on some of the parts underneath the crotch of the model. These models were made about a decade ago, so they still have some parts that are showing the kind of undercut part of the plastic mold. And since we don't really want to highlight them, they're supposed to be negative space, but they're actually part of the model. I just paint them black to simulate shadows and to make sure that your eyes aren't attracted to those parts of the model. The only thing left to do now is the base. I have quite a simple method of doing all my bases for the Beasts of Chaos that I have. I start by applying some PVA glue, and then I usually attach 1 or 2 pieces of pine bark. I bought mine from a pet shop, but you could find this in nature as well. The rest of the base is covered with coconut fiber. You could buy this from, for example, IKEA. It's used as a soil for plants and such, but it works great as a natural material representing dirt, soil, roots from trees, small twigs, anything like that. Finally, I use natural leaf litter from Green Stuff World to represent fallen leaves on the ground, and I glue this on in small patches using PVA as well. Once this is dry, I use 2 different pigment powders from Vallejo, Burnt Sienna and Burnt Umber. I apply these with a dry brush on different random parts of the base. To set them, I spray a coat of matte varnish through the airbrush, and then I paint the edge of the base using Abaddon Black. Finally, on some of the bases, I add Highland Tufts from Army Painter, or some lowland shrubs or white flowers from Green Stuff World. After a coat of matte varnish mixed with satin varnish, about 50% each, this is what the model looks like. This is how I paint all of my Beasts of Chaos models. I think it works very well as a basic scheme. You could of course cut some corners or use more contrast paints if you want to make the process even quicker, but I find that this is a relatively fast way of painting them while also maintaining an okay level of quality overall. Getting a squad of these together will look quite good on the tabletop. Thank you so much for watching. If you found any of this useful, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. Good luck with your miniatures. I'll see you next time.